I was asked to give a short overview of how we've gotten to where we are, just to bring everybody up to speed. Some of you have seen some of these presentations of mine before. We've got this screen here, and this image is an image that came from the Oregonian the day after the flood in early January of 2011, and is showing the story right there is in front of you. The river up there, it strips away the banks when it reaches a certain threshold of stage level. And the riverbed is made of big boulders and rocks, and the riverbank is made of sand. And which one is the first to go? And neither of these three homes had any water in them. They weren't flooded in a traditional sense, but they were devastated by the loss of the bank that held up their foundation. And in fact, there was about 40 feet of property and trees that were in between those homes and the river prior to that particular flood event. So, and this slide used to be called Sustainable Recovery. And we've decided to go ahead and embrace this term of resilience to more collectively talk about the community's approach to this, that all these investments along the way, before a disaster, after a disaster, visioning where you want to go, all collectively help make this community more resilient. And I think the livability of being on the river and in that area, they have to function hand in hand rather than competing with the river or fighting with it. So the outline and purpose of the presentation, this is the same presentation for the most part we briefed our Board of County Commissioners on a few weeks ago to give them a heads up of these projects that were on their way, and the role and responsibility the county has in regards to these projects, and also the emphasis on the direction we're taking up there in trying to have a purposeful, collaborative community engagement process going forward. Looking at the post-2011 accomplishments, the focus on the Channel Migration Zone hazard, and then the theme of this meeting is going from challenges to opportunities and finding ways to translate those hard-to-tackle issues into new way of thinking about doing things. And then lastly, the emphasis is really on community engagement and partnership. So in 2014, we recognized the 50th anniversary of the Christmas Day floods, really on most of the west side of this country. It was a huge event that didn't only hit Oregon or the Sandy River. It went well inland of Northern California, up into Washington, and even into Idaho, Nevada, with heavy rains. But it was a big rain on snow event that created record, if not near record, flooding. And these are photos that the archive from the Mount Hood National Forest, thank you, Vicki, allowed me to come in and go through their photo collection when we were preparing a short video about that event. And this is what we see now. I mean, this was the picture up there. These are all pictures on the Zigzag River of homes that look just like the forward ones, the ones that I had shown at the very beginning of the meeting. So anyway, this is the images that came out of the '64 event. And the post-event report that the Corps of Engineers put out really tells the story. I'm going to read this to you really quickly. This was just a description of the scale of this impact. The flood volume on the Sandy was the greatest of record. The river gradient is very steep, and the river bottom soil is gravelly silt, which offers little resistance to the erosion. It says the result was an action on the valleys and lower slope that was glacier-like. Complete changes in appearance of the valley resulted in many places. For example, the north bank of the Sandy, just upstream from Brightwood, showed no indication of buildings, vegetation, or topsoil where a group of 40 houses existed prior to the flood. Those 40 houses were gone. There was no evidence they were ever there before this river took everything out. Those conditions were repeated to a lesser extent throughout the upper basin. A total of 155 homes were completely destroyed in the Sandy Basin, with a great many more being damaged. Of the majority of these, a majority were unoccupied summer homes, or loss of life would have doubtless been greater than the one that was reported from a debris flow that came down a channel and swept a home off its foundation. But the point being is, this was the level of development that was up in the Sandy Basin at that time, 50 years ago. And since that time, we've really developed a lot up there, and in many locations that were at the time weren't developed. And the whole reason we're talking about this is we've got so much more exposure now than we did then. And a repeat of that flood event, which is certainly possible, would be a much greater extent of impact than just this, 155 homes. So in 2011, this is one of the signature events that happened up there. Was it about 1,000 feet, Mike?
Yeah,
Roughly 1,000 feet of road on Lolo Pass Road, a critical arterial up there that connects a number of homes to Highway 26 was washed out where you can see the river. Well, I've got a non-cooperative laser pointer here. The river meandered way out of its channel, which was right alongside the tree line here, and took out the road. It's probably occupied that spot before, but it decided to reclaim that again. And about how long was that down? Do you remember?
Not that long.
Okay. But for weeks, the homeowners who lived up of that had to really do a navigation around the break area. And then, of course, there was a bridge, the Zigzag River Bridge on this road also was scoured and undermined and had to be closed and repaired as well. And that meant a long workaround for people when they were driving through that area. And one of the things that we saw, of course, is here's a major meander just downstream of that point. Here's two critical roads, a Lolo Pass on the right, Barlow Trail on the left, and then the evidence that the river is actively scouring directly into those roadways and threatening those, and the work that has to be undertaken to protect those roads that we've traditionally done has just been a lot of rip-wrapping, armoring with rocks. And what we found is that a lot of that armoring really, it may defend that spot for a time, but it actually creates greater erosion from that point and downstream. And then you have this acceleration both of river velocity and everyone else armoring to protect their properties. And so recognizing that this is a natural function of the area is critical for us about how do we address this. I should say the arrow that's right there on the right-hand side is this property that was right there at the time on Lolo's Pass Road. I took this photo the afternoon of the flood, and then this one was several months later in the summer. And you can see now there's a very active channel running right under the back corner of that house where there was 60 feet of land there at one time before the river migrated right into it. And we ended up using a FEMA grant to purchase this house as a flood acquisition. But there's not much you can do right there. Even if you elevate the house, you're still putting yourself in jeopardy by the proximity of the river and the loss of connectivity if the river takes the bank you're building on. And so what we came away with in working with the contractors that did this evaluation for us was these are the most basic set of findings. We've got banks of sand and riverbeds of boulders, and which one gives first when you got a high water event? That the bank is softer, that it doesn't need a flood, quote unquote, in order to cause damage, that the historic protective measures that we've been doing for decades of armoring and channeling and trying to convey the water through there has built a false sense of safety and caused properties to build in areas, albeit we didn't understand the risk at the time, but in areas that are now we're understanding better are subject to potential catastrophic loss. And that basically, because of the nature of this river and the power of this river, we should really start considering how do we find ways to give this river more room to do what it's doing, and in fact create a more stable living situation at the same time. And so these policy issues were emerging after that event. We did a lot of work at the time. The county convened an interdepartmental flood recovery group that started meeting in March or April of 2011, and we've been meeting bi-weekly ever since then. And it's a very dynamic group that's now turning their attention not just from the Sandy River, but to urban flooding that's going on more in the western county. But we were looking at the goals and objectives that we really wanted to have in place going forward for a next flood event, and emphasizing what our role is in the county at a departmental level, but just in a general on dealing with flood recovery. And then the planning that's necessary that we're just really about to start embarking on. We want to adopt and instill this no adverse impacts approach that the Association of State Floodplain Managers advocates. It's been legally tested and substantiated. about making decisions that minimize impact both to the river and to the properties, that building in such a way that you're not increasing the risk or threat to other properties at the same time while you're trying to protect one on its own. We've been emphasizing flood insurance, the role of flood insurance in this area, even though erosion hazards are not a mapped aspect of the FEMA maps as they're presented. People can get a better deal if they're outside of the mapped flood insurance zone, and in many cases, the river moved outside of that zone anyway, and that it's a good investment for the return. That you're able to get the insurance, and you get the full benefit of the program, and it gives you some recourse. And if you don't have the insurance, you're basically on your own at a property loss. That understanding the level of protection that's necessary up there in terms of the public and the private properties, because there's a lot of infrastructure at risk, and we'll talk about that, as well as an enormous number of private homes. That we've talked about this from the week after that event, about this aspect of buyouts as a voluntary option for neighborhoods up there. And something that we do, that FEMA does all across the country, is just really trying to find a way to advocate for giving the rivers more room, to allow them to spread out more. And when they spread out, they slow down. And so if you make room for them, often it creates a better accommodation for living with the river instead of having to go into defensiveness to fight it all the time. It was brought up at some of our community meetings early in 2013 and 14, the idea of a special improvement district, a taxation assessment district for these communities, so they would have a funding source to do projects on their own and not directly be responsible for the county to be the matching force for that, and give them a little more self-determination and ownership of the problems. And then trying to think about this idea of pre-covery, as Josh Bruce has called it, anticipating recovery ahead of when we have a disaster, so that you have a framework of what you want to do already, and you're not scrambling under all that kind of public and political pressure to act quickly when you may not have really decided what's the right thing to do. And then lastly is this visioning, what do we want this area to look like in 20, 30, 40 years? How heavily developed or how much do we kind of pull back? What are the economic benefits of making some adaptations and adjustments up there? These are all things that we're in a position here to talk about as we go forward with this planning effort we're doing. And then the report, it's in the back, the Channel Migration Report by Natural Systems Design. Here's some of the findings, like the very first slide I had just shown you, is we have to accept that this is a volcanic landscape, first and foremost, that this is the driver of what's going on up there. The nature of the soils that are in those river valleys are actually some of the youngest soils in Oregon, except for the beaches, because they were formed the most recent just about 250 years ago in the last eruptive cycle. And if we're not thinking that we're living on an active volcano that still has swarms every week, or at least earthquakes every week, and swarms periodically every year, with fumaroles of active gassing, and another period could come up in our lifetime or not. But this mountain's makeup is what these communities are based inside of. And just to give you this picture, when we were doing surveys along the river, I took this photo of these 3 layers of lahars here. The bottom one is from the Timberline Rim event from 1,500 years ago, and then the 2 above it are from the Old Maid event that was about 250 years ago. And they think that the volcano erupted for about 10 years during that last period that laid these 2 deep deposits down. But there's a house that's built on top of it. That's the top of the floodplain in the river, and here's all this material that's been cut into after the 2011 flood. I think this one area lost about 20 feet of land in that flood, and there's a big rock that's sticking out over the river that was part of the flood there. But the whole point is, this is what we've got to work with up there in terms of the land, the river valley. And so what happened in 1964 with that huge river, atmospheric river, or Pineapple Express that came in on top of snow is it like a glacier. It came down the river valley, it scoured the homes away. And the response to that at the time that was typical around the country was to come in and fix the river, to channelize it, to get these heavy bulldozers in the river channel there and move all that debris around to help create a single channel for this river to convey the energy quickly. And no fault on anyone. That's just how it was done back then. But it set up a precedent going forward. And so here's what that looked like. That arrow is basically at the bottom where that photograph was taken, just downstream of where Timberline Rim is. It's that kind of notch that sticks out there as one side of the river. And this is before it was developed in the early 70s. But this is a fixed river. This is what it looks like. And within 5 years, as the Timberline Rim development was going in, the river was already leaving its channel. It was already moving around and figuring out that it wanted to go somewhere else. It didn't take that long. But we had already basically seen that development was encroaching into an area that now was basically safer than it was before the '64 flood. And this is one of the reasons why there's a lot of research talking about flood control systems only work for so long, and they don't cancel the risk. They often exacerbate the risk because people build in areas that would have been dangerous if that flood control system wasn't there. And then when it fails catastrophically. So this is just showing you how this river takes back what it once had. And point being in 2012, this was after the flood, you can see, I'm going to have to walk up here, pardon me, be a hand model here. But what you can see is there's an old channel that went this way and went up this way, and then after the 2005 event, it went here. 2012, it went here, and that the report basically shows this river channel wants to push in that direction. And where the tennis courts are at the top of the screen, they lost the Timberline Rim Homeowners Association lost 111 feet right there, and it deposited most of it just downstream on the other side. But there were scars and depositions all along this area. But the issue is that everyone in these areas are fighting to maintain what they've got because the river has been threatening the homes here and also the homes on the outside of these bends. And I'm sure it's an expensive fight to wage, and to have to keep maintaining that line of defense, and the permitting process is very complicated and onerous, and it's got to be a hard slog every year when the rocks start tumbling down the river at night, and you can hear the river coming up. Is how high is it going to get? And so the report, I think one of the biggest takeaways from the report are these risk maps. I've got the full suite of maps along with the report on the back table. But what it shows in this, we have a hazards map that's coupled with a risk map. But the risk map is really the one that gives us some actionable information, I think. I'm going to walk around here again. Because the FEMA zone is this hatched area here, and it only occupies a fairly narrow portion. But the charter of the folks who did this report were to give us an assessment of the channel migration zone. This is Timberline Rim. This is the main area. All these black squares are homes. This is what they call Division 5 that's on the other side of the river. But this red line is the outer area that they've identified as being the potential for a channel migration zone, probably for a 1964 scale event. And then they gave us this line. It's called the Emergency Protection Action Line, and it's basically for the county to have a line that says, you know, if this river starts encroaching beyond this line, that where this road is, Brightwood Loop Road, the county better start thinking about what they're going to do right here. Are they going to move the road? Are they going to put in something to protect it? But that's potentially a project area to protect that. And then this area that's in this line right here, I'm trying to see. There's a blue that's on the other map, but basically it's where the river has been since 1914 to 2014. It was a perfect 400-year interval. And so they mapped that, and then they added a 100-foot buffer to it. That's this zone, and that's the purple. And this is what would basically be an area that could be eroded with a comparable storm event like 2011. And so it's outside of the FEMA zone, but it's well up into the terrace of some of these properties off on the bank. And when we added up all the homes that are inside this purple zone right here, we got 416 homes in a 10-mile reach of the river. And that's a lot of homes that could be in jeopardy if we have a flood, a likely flood of the same scale that we had in 2011. And so the basis for this map, right now they're only advisory. They've not been adopted by the county. Right now they're not adopted by the state, and the state does not have a channel migration zone policy for land use management and regulation. So we're all here at the crux of some major decision points of how do we work with an issue and a need and a challenge when we don't really have a formal framework on how to deal with it. That's what we're here to talk about. So I quickly did this add up. I'm glad that our tax assessor is in the room. He might be able to validate some of these. But our GIS department did a quick scan of the properties that were in that zone. And, you know, this was 2015 data, so we were adding up, here's the value of all the structure and land, the fair market value, the assessed value, and then the taxes that are collected from those properties. And the average price out of all of those is about $250,000. But we know some of them are way above that. But when you look at, you know, over half of them are just $200,000 or below. And some of them are quite small properties at about $100,000 or less. So there's a wide variety of issues that would be there, you know, when thinking about how would you approach acquisitions, you know, for who would go, how would you organize it, categorize it, where would you get the money? How long would it take if people wanted to opt in for that? And then we did this analysis back right after the flood. I haven't updated these slides yet, but we looked at the river miles where Timberline Rim were, and of the 14 properties that were affected there that had substantial erosion, these were the values of those properties at the time, but there were about 95 other ones that were also at risk with the same level of proximity to the bank that added up to about 19 million or more, almost 20. But of those, you know, 110 properties, only 48 had flood insurance. Some of them probably had it because they were required, but some may have opted in. But we felt like the amount of exposure was pretty high compared to the level of coverage that's there. And it's certainly an area that we've been urging over and over again, that flood insurance is something you should seriously consider to help offset an impact. And so one of the other areas I wanted to just highlight was that this isn't just about public property and housing. You know, after that washout on Lolo Pass Road, our roads department had worked to secure federal highway grant to do this alternative study to look at this long-term ability of if we were going to relocate the footprint of Lolo Pass Road, how would it look like and what are the options for doing it? But it meant that we were really taking seriously. We can't keep repairing this road over and over again the way that we did that time. It's a huge cost. It's a huge impact on the county's annual funds, and we don't have those kind of reserves. And it would be better to think about this if there were options on doing something differently. Likewise as well, the wastewater system up there that's managed by the Water and Environment Services Office, on the lower right-hand corner, their outfall for the area was blown out. And it definitely jeopardized their ability to manage the processes they have up there. And so in that coarse, sandy, gravelly area, you know, it's the water perk test means that you have to have most of these folks on a system, and the system is very much down in the river. And so it's at jeopardy from channel migration. The picture on the left-hand side shows a number of locations where you've got these water pipes that support the properties and the communities on both sides, and the river's actively eroding into those areas where the pipe goes under the river, and it's jeopardizing both the water and the wastewater. That's one of the things that Don Shea is here to bring to our attention. And then lastly, I've got the signal that we're winding down, is we've got to think about climate change and the future conditions of the river, because this river isn't standing still. And one of the findings in the report back there was that in the next generation or two, we can really expect the conditions on the mountain to change. This is a map showing this snowfall intermix. The white is basically annually, where it's predominantly snowfall. The blue is the intermix zone, where you get snow and rain. And then that little green spot up in the lower basin is 100% rain all year long. So this is really the way that it's been. But the forecast going into the future is that with warmer winters, that we're going to get more precipitation as rain on the mountain rather than snow. And so the snow zone is going to really retreat up in elevation on the mountain for annual snow. The intermix zone, of course, is going to get bigger, but so is the rainfall zone, which means so much of the rain in those big storm events is not going to be captured as snow. It's going to directly come down the rivers as rain. It's not going to be buffered, and that the river is likely to become more flashy. And when it's flashy, it's moving more sediment, and the more sediment, the more dynamics go on in the tendency of this river to migrate. So it's just basically saying the future conditions are, we're probably going to have more dynamic rain events that are going to trigger flood events, or erosion events, I should say. But we don't have to look to 60 years out to know what that looks like. In 2015, I think a lot of people who watch this mountain realize, hey, there's hardly any snow up there the entire summer. It was barren up there. It was like a dust bowl when I was up there on the chairlift in August. And when the snow's not there, the only thing up there that's exposed is just this fine, dusty, particulate pumice and gravels that are easily mobilized in rainfalls. And so if we think that climate change issue is something that's really abstract and way off, all we have to do is look back to 2015 to see it actually has already happened and demonstrated what it looks like, and it's not a myth. And this article from the Portland Tribune highlights that Mount Hood Meadows is actually trying to think about how to capitalize on this. Instead of having so much of an emphasis on snow recreation, they're really rethinking having much more of a summer-based recreation plan as well, to capitalize on the mountain not having the kind of snow capacity that traditionally it has. And that's an adaptation that they're looking at for the changing environment up there. And that's kind of a point that we should think about. But another point that we have to think about, and we've seen it so much the last few summers, is wildfire. And the basin up there around the Hoodland district has been lucky that it hasn't had a significant wildfire in a very long time. But we know that that's only a matter of time. And what we've seen in the gorge, what we've seen around the state and around the country, is with those hot winds coming in, it doesn't take much. And what a wildfire means for this situation is, if you denude the forest, the river's going to get it. So in many ways, in the coming generations, the threats to the river's stability are really getting stacked. And climate change is this big driver for that. It's going to affect the glaciation and the snowfall. It's going to affect the wildfire hazards. And these two hazards are going to definitely up the ante on what goes on in that river in the long term. And so, winding this up, we've had a public awareness event we call the Flood of Information every year since 2011. We just completed our sixth one a few weeks ago in the Sandy area. But it's our opportunity to roll out what we're up to. It's one of the main ways that we provide feedback and make sure that the community members are aware of what we're doing and allow them to have a chance to talk to us and share.